Hello, everyone. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I have a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Pennsylvania here in Philadelphia. And today I wanted to talk about a topic that seems to come up every single year. You can sort of set a watch to it. Every single year, a study comes out that attempts to determine whether there are meaningful neurophysiological differences that distinguish the brains of males and females. So obviously this is a rather fraught topic, particularly as we learn more and more about the complex biology underlying sex and gender. But the fundamental question that some scientists have been interested in understanding is whether there are meaningful biological distinctions at the level of the brain. So, spicy topic, no doubt. But just stick with me. We're just focusing on the findings that past researchers and then this particular group pretty recently have made. And to the extent that we're going to discuss like social topics, it's really just going to be from like an anthropological perspective of early humans relative to other primates. So no commentary on gender or contemporary society or politics. Okay, with that caveat in mind, the term we use for traits that are distinct between males and females is dimorphism. Okay, and we see dimorphisms throughout the animal kingdom. So here are some examples. Plenty of species exhibit dimorphic characteristics. Probably one of the first that might come to mind is the peacock, or the peafowl, the peacock, with the sort of crazy tail display that seems excessive. But mallards, some spiders, and of course primates like chimpanzees and gorillas as well. So it's certainly reasonable for people to contemplate the various levels at which males and females vary. Okay. So you can infer quite a bit about how a species operates by, how they physically appear. And so, of course, you can get a sense of likely habitats, ecosystems, and so on, these types of things. If they have wings, they probably fly, or at least had an ancestor that used to fly. If they have limbs that can, wrap around things and grab them, they might inhabit trees. If they have fins and flippers, they're most likely spending most of their time in the water, right? Obvious stuff like that. But you can also infer quite a bit about a species by how sexually dimorphic they are, okay? By how different male and female members of the species appear to be. So one of the more, consistent things you can predict is whether a species is a tournament species or a pair bonding species. And so right off the bat, many species aren't exactly one or the other, right? Like almost all things in biology and behavior, we see a sort of spectrum of tournament versus, pair bonding. But broadly speaking, when the males of a given species are significantly bigger or exhibit significant differences in plumage or things like that, that generally indicates that reproduction is determined by males competing with each other, okay? But when the males and females of a given species are sort of largely indistinguishable, you're likely looking at a pair bonding species. And so there are many examples of both, but just sticking to primates, our relatives. If you look at a picture of male and female marmosets, okay, you'll probably struggle to identify which is which. But if you take a look at a picture of like male and female baboons, you can certainly tell that there are some differences between those two adult baboons. And so guess which primate species is the tournament species and which is the pair bonding species. That's right. Marmosets will tend to pair bond, while baboons are a tournament species, with males competing for the opportunity to reproduce. And so when I say tournament species, we're talking about situations where like 5% of the males end up producing like 95% of the offspring. So like super disproportionate, reproductive situation. Okay, and so here are some examples. And perhaps the most intuitive version of this dynamic is when males physically fight, each other for the opportunity to reproduce. And so, it's worth keeping in mind when it comes to tournament species that it's not exclusively competition in the form of a physical confrontation, right? So, things like the beautiful Peacock Tale. It's called a train, evidently. That's what the tail is called. But these are just like other venues for the same fundamental thing, right? Males competing for nearly exclusive opportunities to reproduce. And like, by the way, growing up in Miami, I certainly saw peacocks fight. And, see, even when they spend all of that, evolutionary, all that biological energy on like their, pretty absurd, feather displays, they still engage in physical confrontation, right? tournament species. Okay, so on top of being able to tell how it is that reproduction likely happens in any given species by evaluating whether they have any sexual dimorphism, you can also infer a bit about their social structures and how it is that members of the species interact with one another. And, there are all kinds of things that animals do, like in a tournament species, things like infanticide, generally males committing infanticide with what are likely the offspring of other males. And, all kinds of behaviors will tend to be predictable as a function of, the reproductive intervals of females, meaning like how frequently females of the species are able to give birth to offspring. Or, what happens when a new male ascends to the primary mating, position in a tournament species, like how he treats the young offspring that are still around from the last guy. So, there are even examples of, when a new male becomes the primary mating male in a given group, the females around him who were pregnant at the time, when he ascends, can miscarry and lose their pregnancies. So one example is that the new male will just like harass pregnant females, causing them to experience, extremely elevated stress and then resulting in a miscarriage as a consequence. But in some rodent species, however, just the odor of a new male can cause miscarriage, independently of any kind of like behavioral, interaction or harassment. And so, we see this with hamsters, for example. However, this is interesting. However, interestingly, if the new male who's exposed to a pregnant female is a close relative of the former male, the miscarriage is less likely, which implies there's some, interesting evolutionary strategies going on there, right, to pass on genes. And so, there's some really interesting things that the females of some species do, things like pseudoestrus, or sometimes called behavioral estrus, where they'll exhibit like some of the signs of being, receptive to reproduction, sexually receptive, ovulating, in heat, let's say, and so on, right? But they're not actually ovulating, right? It's sort of like they're putting on a disguise to make it appear as though they're reproductively, receptive. And so how would that be useful? Well, when this new dude, right, shows up and is interested in reproducing, right, and a female member of the species is already pregnant from the last male, then this new male is quite a bit less likely to commit infanticide when she ultimately gives birth, right, to the offspring she had with the former male. It's not like the new male species, have like charts and graphs and like textbooks, right, where they're studying reproductive biology that help them to understand how long it was between, when they mated and when offspring showed up, right? So pseudoestrus is sort of like a biological disguise to protect the offspring that a female had with a separate male. Pretty crazy, right? Purely biology. And so, this is a simplification of quite a bit of complexity, obviously, right? For example, everything I've discussed so far has focused on either monogamous or polygynous reproduction. But we see a fair bit of polyandry throughout the animal kingdom, right? So situations where instead of what's essentially like a single breeding male, you have a single female with several males. And there are various manifestations of this, these kinds of social orders, right? So for example, there's successional polyandry, associated polyandry, and interestingly, a structure called adelphic polyandry, which is where a woman or a female is married to a set of brothers. And so, by the way, just Philadelphia trivia, have you ever wondered why Philadelphia, which is where I live, right, is called the city of brotherly love? It's all in the name. So, which is based in Greek. So Phil, meaning beloved or friend, and Adelphia, meaning brother. So it's quite literally named after brotherly love. I don't know, kind of cool. Took me a while to understand that, to figure that out, but maybe embarrassingly long. But anyway, so we see instances of adelphic polyandry throughout the animal kingdom. So like lions, for example, can have two brother lions forming these kinds of structures with mating females. But perhaps most relevantly to our conversation today, we also see examples of it, among humans. So in Tibet, Nepal, parts of India, some parts of Africa, we see examples of this kind of polyandry. And so among other primates, there's also some interesting tendencies where, the primates that tend to live in trees, called arboreal, they tend to be less sexually dimorphic than the ones that live on the ground, called, terrestrial. So, if you see substantial sexual dimorphism, in a primate, you're probably looking at a primate that doesn't spend all that much time in trees. Kind of interesting, right? So, this whole topic begins to depart from like strictly biology and reproduction and enter into more sort of socio-political domains, when we're focused on humans. But the relationships between like how a species reproduces, their anatomies and their biologies, and the social structures that they create are demonstrated all throughout the animal kingdom. And so the point here is that you can tend to predict a lot about how a species behaves just by knowing those things, just some of the basic anatomies and their basic biology. So why do I bring all this up? Well, as I mentioned, right, this is not a dichotomous feature of animal biology. Plenty of species fall somewhere along a spectrum between tournament and pair bonding. And given, all of these observations and data, an obvious next question would be, are humans a tournament or a pair bonding species? So, that's why I'm harping on this being a dynamic that's better characterized as a spectrum rather than, a dichotomous sort of designation, right? Meaning it's not like a species must be either a tournament or a pair bonding species, So and there are several criteria by which we might find where along that spectrum humans might fall, right? But let's focus on, some of the ones that I think are the most intuitive. So first of all, we certainly have dimorphic traits, right? Males do tend to be slightly larger than females, but the difference is significantly attenuated relative to other more highly sexually dimorphic primates, like gorillas, for example, or orangutans. And so, of course, there are other things, like the distribution of body hair and hip size and, the size and function of mammary glands and breasts and all the obvious ones, right? But there are perhaps also subtler differences like the brow ridge projection, right? And like lower facial shapes. Though it turns out, that might strike you as being sort of obvious, but it turns out that, there are arguments that not all modern humans are particularly dimorphic, even on, these structures, with, some variability to the extent, or in the extent to which, this can be found across different, groups of humans. So there's a paper from 2014 that explores specifically human craniofacial dimorphism, okay? So, the face bones, right? For all the people who love to focus on the bones, right? And, it's really an anthropology paper up there, but they explore this whole topic in a way that also incorporates, social organization and, the degree of cooperation and things like that, right? It's an interesting paper, and they basically argue that as humans evolved over the course of, hundreds of thousands of years, we grew to become less dimorphic. And again, they explore the likely social conditions that accompanied those changes or perhaps fostered those changes. So, the reality is, like, when you disregard the sort of socially motivated differences that can be associated with being, a male or a female, things like clothing, hair length, these types of things. And of course, we're working in generalities here, but when you disregard those factors, the differences just aren't nearly as significant as other primates when it comes to humans. Other primate species that are tournament species, right? So, relative to many of our primate cousins, humans tend to be less sexually dimorphic. So the other criteria, so that was one. The other criteria by which we can, evaluate whether humans are tournament or pair bonding is maybe a little bit more interesting and certainly a bit more microscopic, right? You couldn't just see it with your eyes. So imprinted genes are genes that offspring inherit that entirely depend upon, which parent imparts them, right? So rather than being sort of a combination of genes from each parent, imprinted genes are ones that are entirely determined by, who a person's mother or their father is. Okay, so some examples. Insulin-like growth factor, like the gene for insulin-like growth factor, it's inherited from the father. And if it's inherited from the father, it'll be expressed. If it's inherited from the mother, it is not expressed. And so that's just one, right? There are imprinted genes that participate in all kinds of, development, biological development and behavior. Like, another interesting one is how effectively a developing male fetus will absorb glucose from the pregnant mother's blood, circulatory system. And so what are the consequences of that? So that can result in things like pregnancy hypoglycemia, which is, based sort of like diabetes. And there are even more examples of these types of things. And I'm happy to sort of talk about, the like evolutionary biology, underlying imprinted genes. But the point is that, we see some of these imprinted genes in humans. And so, you might ask, like, what would the evolutionary advantage of that be, right? Well, if a male has reproduced with a female who can only, mate and reproduce, with relatively few males and on a certain, cycle, if they're capable of inhibiting the female's capability of reproducing again afterwards, after giving birth to his offspring, he's essentially inhibiting the capabilities of other humans to reproduce after he has by inducing something like pregnancy hypoglycemia or diabetes, thereby compromising the future survival of the reproductive capabilities of the female. It's just like pretty messed up, right? But the lives of tournament species can be pretty perilous, right? So generally speaking, we see a higher frequency of imprinted genes in tournament species, more so than we see in pair bonding species. So why would that be, right? Because in a pair bonding species, the pairs are essentially mating for life, right? There's no real chance that another mate will enter the picture, right, of this pair, or at least significantly lower chances than those of a tournament species where it's the norm. And so, there's no evolutionary incentive to compromise the ability of a potential mate, to mate with another mate after they mated with you, right? So there's just no evolutionary, benefit or advantage to doing so. So imprinted genes are typically associated with tournament species. And we know that humans have at least some imprinted genes. But relative to primates that are, closer to the more tournament side, than the pair bonding side, we're sort of closer to the pair bonding side. We're sort of somewhere in the middle, right? We're not either or in terms of like how many imprinted genes we have. All right, so I think that understanding of these kinds of sort of basic evolutionary characteristics of humans is kind of helpful to understand when engaging questions about how different any given characteristic may or may not be between male and female humans, and including the brain. So we're certainly among the less sexually dimorphic primates, but they're examples of some dimorphism at various levels of our biology. Okay, so we're going to talk about a study coming out of Rosalind Franklin University of Medicine and Science, which is a highly regarded institution in Chicago. Okay, and this is what they did is called a meta-analysis, which is where a group of scientists collect a large number of studies, in this case quite a large number of studies, that all sort of engage the same topic to get a sense of whether there might be a consensus that arises from all of that research that they've collected, right? And so the scientists note that while other fields have been engaging this question for a fairly long time, like psychology and as we noted earlier, anthropology, and the science in those disciplines has matured a fair bit, at this point, neuroscience hasn't really quite arrived at a comparable consensus, right? So, it's like every year it seems like we get a new, package of papers and, studies that explores this question. And some will tend to arrive at, disparate conclusions, right? Oftentimes depending upon, by the way, and this will come up later on, the methods and the techniques that they use to conduct their evaluations, right? Like if they're exploring, broad anatomy or genetics or, cellular molecular features of biology, right? That can oftentimes be associated with how likely they are to agree with one another. And so the authors note that it's customary to refer to sex as like an immutable biological factor that distinguishes females and males, generally focusing on biological features like, chromosomes, reproductive organs, and, the concentrations of things like, hormones like testosterone and estrogen. And they emphasize that both sex and gender, right, are deeply entangled, neurophysiologically. And so it can be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to disentangle the extent to which, genetic or biological factors or socialization or environmental experiences dominate how these things are determined, okay? And so their solution to this challenge, or to the challenges that can arise, right, from this, is to basically collapse all the differences and just accept that, the studies they're considering almost always operate according to how people self-identify, right? And, I think that's a fairly reasonable decision, at least in my opinion. And so they open with noting that studies have, over time, noted differences between men and women that have been, explored, over time, explored in the past, right? So things like psychiatric conditions, and I'll touch on a little bit later on after this study, but also more sort of like behavioral or cognitive measures, right? Things like physical aggression, mental rotation abilities, peer attachment, but that, broadly speaking, the differences that are identified tend to be rather small. So they note that about 85% of those differences exhibit effect sizes that would be considered small by, the metrics that would be applied throughout science, okay? And so they include a figure in their paper that honestly I don't love, but it does help to illustrate the point that they're making, right? And their point is that certain conditions and disorders tend to be quite a bit more frequently diagnosed in males than in females, and then also vice versa, right? With autism and ADHD more commonly identified in males, while depression and eating disorders more so in females. So apart from like a handful of measures, which, again, are not consistently associated with neurophysiological differences, most of the differences that are identified in, studies like this, they tend to be pretty small, right? And they're typically not associated with any kind of, biological substrate, meaning like any kind of biological explanation for these differences, like why these differences may exist. And I'm sure you're already thinking like of potential causes for things like, alcohol use disorder or eating disorders, that may have fairly little, if not nothing to do with, biology. And so, to be clear, there is definitely some biology associated with these findings, right? So, for example, potential genetic and developmental and even microbial explanations for why autism spectrum disorders tend to be more commonly identified in males, which I definitely plan on talking about at some point, the microbial findings. They were done by a scientist named Tracy Bale, who used to be at the University of Pennsylvania, where I did my research. But anyways, topic for another day. The reality is that, like, at least from the perspective of neuroscience, the science just hasn't really had enough time to mature to a level that's commensurate with, other disciplines that explore this question: psychology, anthropology, and so on, right? And so here's what this team did. They collected, again, a rather large number of studies that all tend to use similar methods, right, to compare males and females in brain structure and in brain function. And, they even included other meta-analyses in their sort of collection of findings, right? And as well as systematic reviews, so not exclusively scientific experiments. So they're really taking a big picture look at all of the evidence that's been collected over the years. And so they also ensured to expand the scope of their, inclusion criteria for this study by not exclusively using terms like sex difference or gender difference, right? When you're like looking for studies throughout the field, you have to use words, right, to identify studies. And so they extended their search criteria. And this is sort of critical because, like, if you're only working with, those types of terms, sex differences, gender differences, you're likely going to be artificially selecting for studies that ultimately tend to identify differences, right, rather than those that do not find differences. And that's sort of a central challenge to these studies, right? Broadly speaking, there may be a tendency for more experiments that do find differences to be published more frequently than those that don't, right? And that's basically for two main reasons. The first, there may be a tendency for journals to prefer to publish studies that do identify differences between males and females, right? Because they suspect that people will be more interested in reading those types of studies. But, and more importantly, and this is a little inside baseball-y, right? Many of these studies emerge from a convenient thing, right, that scientists can do whenever they conduct basically any study involving animals in general, right, when they have both male and female, components of their sample, right? So here's an example, right? Let's say you're interested in understanding how it is that, rats respond to a given drug in specific situations. Like, let's say, alprazolam or Xanax, right? And so you're testing if rats will exhibit reduced anxiety or, anxiolysis, if they'll exhibit reduced anxiety-associated behavior when they're exposed to like a super strong odorant, right? Like peppermint right in their face. And they're, rodents are very olfactorily driven, right? Their sense of smell is very dominant for how they navigate the environment. Or when they're, let's say you're putting these rodents on a super elevated pole, right? And they have to balance to avoid falling off for extended periods of time. Or, if you put them in a room with like super duper bright lights, right? Rodents hate bright lights. And let's say you have a group of like 40 rats. And, like any good neuroscientist, you include both male and female rats. Okay, so let's say you find that Xanax has no significant effect on the anxiety that, when rats are like put it on an elevated pole in super bright lights, right? When they're put in an anxiogenic environment, when they're put in an environment that's intrinsically anxiety inducing. And so you don't find an effect of Xanax, of alprazolam. So in science, there's a phrase, publish or perish, right? And that whole phrase describes the reality that, like, if you want to have a career in like actual scientific research, you have to be publishing on a fairly regular basis. And if you're not, it becomes increasingly difficult to obtain the funding that's needed to conduct research. And so, our imaginary scientist has failed to find any positive effect of Xanax on anxiety. And, in that specific situation, they're in kind of a bind, right? They need to publish something. Otherwise, it's going to be increasingly difficult to sustain their career. So, and this is a problem that's pretty consistent in how like science is published, not science in general, right? in pursuit of any possible publication, right? After you fail to find any effect, the scientists may take a second look at their data, right? Which includes, both female and male rats, and then ask, okay, this wasn't my initial question, but do male and female rats react to Xanax differently? Okay, and so then if they ultimately find that there's a difference, then they'll write up their experiments and they'll send it over to a journal for publication. But if they don't find any difference between how it is that like female and male rats respond to Xanax, right, they're probably unlikely to even try submitting their findings to a journal, right, for publication. It's it's just back to the drawing board for them, and they're pretty upset, but some time to design some new experiments. So like, why am I getting into this? Like, why does this matter? So what that means is that there may very well have, they may have found that there's like no significant difference in how it is that male and female animals respond to a drug, right? Their initial question, but the rest of the field, us, will never know that. And as a result, only the studies that do find a difference will ultimately tend to get published, at least more frequently. And so when someone looks through, the research that's available, that's been published over the years to get a sense of what scientists have found, they're likely to see, or it's possible that they will see far more studies that do show a difference than studies that don't show a difference, which would be an artificial amplification of one particular result, that they do find a difference. Okay. Oh, hey, Aaron. Good to see you, man. So thank you for joining. And Dee, hello. Thanks for joining. And so, I've seen this whole effect called different things, this whole like artificial amplification of certain findings, but probably the most common term for it is the file drawer effect. Publishers will tend to prefer studies that find a positive effect, that Xanax does reduce anxiety in rats, than if they find, studies that find negative effects, where if they, if they're finding, as it was, that, there's no significant difference between male and female rats, they're just less likely to publish that. And so, their publishers just aren't as interested in a study that's like, we studied whether male and female chimpanzees, exhibit differences in preferences for the scent of bananas over apples, but we didn't find any differences, right? That's just not that particularly interesting, or at least from the perspective of publishers, but it's still scientifically important. So all of this to say, this group was aware of this problem, and they tried to expand their ability to detect studies that explored the possibilities of differences between males and females, whether there were or weren't actually differences that were found. And I think that's commendable, from a purely scientific perspective. And so, they were looking for differences in published research that weren't necessarily focused on disparities between males and females. All right, all that out of the way, a little primer on the publishing world in science. Let's get into their findings. So they begin with differences in overall brain volume, and they found, so just the size of the brain. And so they found that the general size of the brain is larger in males relative to females, and this comports with, the general findings over the years, right? But they scrutinized this a little bit further, okay? And so as we, acknowledged earlier on during our discussion of sexual dimorphism in humans, males tend, there's just their overall body size, they tend to be larger than females. And in general, larger bodies will require larger brains. And so, for both males and females, larger body size, correlates with larger brain size, both males and females. And this applies to both gray and white matter. So both the neuronal cell bodies, the gray matter, and the connectivity, the connections between them, the white matter. But some of the studies identified that there was a higher gray matter to white matter ratio in females, suggesting that females will tend to have more neuronal cell bodies relative to the connectivity between them when compared to what males will have. So ultimately it just seemed, or their conclusion was that it seemed that just having a larger brain tended to be associated with just having a greater proportion of white matter, the connectivity between neurons again, and that having more both, just more white matter rather than having both more white and gray matter. Okay, but the real question is what happens when you control for body size, okay? And so, if you're comparing females and males of the same size, right? Do we still see some of those same differences in brain size and in gray matter to white matter ratios and stuff like that? And so their findings suggest that we do not. So in other words, if you were to take a female that's smaller than a male to whom you're comparing, and you just took your biological Photoshop resize tool, right, and made her the same size as the male, any differences you detected between the brain sizes and gray to white matter ratios, they'd probably be less significant. Just if you're comparing a female to a male of the same sizes, same story. So that's the main argument that these scientists make, after, and we'll get into some more of their findings, but that was the main argument, that, based on their assessment of a rather large collection of studies, it indicates that, after controlling for general body size, these differences aren't particularly significant. And so here's a quote from the lead author, Elliott, I believe is how you pronounce her name. So, quote, "Men and women's brains do differ slightly, but the key finding is that these distinctions are due to brain size, not sex or gender. Sex differences in the brain are tiny and inconsistent once individuals' head size is accounted for." Okay, so, again, it's just a function of size, not necessarily a function of, inherited sex, right? And so in their study, they explore potential differences at a deeper level, which is sort of why I found this study to be, at least to be interesting, if not a bit provocative. So, for example, the difference in total brain volume, which is, just about the difference in the sizes of brains, right, is about 11%, okay, between male and female, right? But any neuroscientist worth their weight in, I don't know, nicotine or in cerebral spinal fluid, I don't know, sodium and potassium, any good neuroscientist would be unsatisfied with just knowing brain size. So there are plenty of animals on Earth that have brains that are a bit larger than the human brain, okay? And so here's a comparison. And so, humans have pretty big brains, for sure, relative to the animals, but they're smaller than the elephant brain, which you can see right next to the human brain. That's the elephant brain right there. So elephants are super intelligent, make no mistake, don't get me wrong. But I don't know anyone would seriously argue that, elephants are more intelligent than humans, right? And if they do make that argument, I think they're making a fundamentally different argument, which is, really a value judgment on human intelligence, which is, a fair argument to make, but it's not really what we're talking about when we're evaluating human intelligence, right? So this group acknowledges that brain size alone is just an unsatisfying way to measure any interesting differences, right? And as someone who spent his PhD focused on this, specific neuronal circuit within the brain, I dig this point that they make here. Okay. And ultimately they argue that, while those kinds of like large scale differences are worth acknowledging and are meaningful, as neuroscientists, we're more interested in whether circuit level functional differences exist, right? And from my reading, they basically note that no studies have really effectively scrutinized this level of potential differences, right? Basically everything that's been done so far was at a much larger scale, right? Than the level of anatomy that like really matters, the circuit level. And so here's a quote from the study. So recognizing that brain size is related to body size and that human bodies are indeed sexually dimorphic, neuroscientists have struggled to find ways of comparing brain structures between men and women that don't merely reflect bodily size differences. Thus, every major study confirms that it is not only global measures like ICV, that means intracranial volume, TBV, total brain volume, total GM, gray matter, total white matter, and CSF, cerebral spinal fluid, volume, right? So differences in the volumes of all those things that are larger in males, but every zone of the cerebral cortex and every subcortical structure when reported as raw, native, or uncorrected volume. So, like, again, that's the fundamental argument that they're making here, right? That these large-scale anatomical differences are really a correlate of, already established and fairly subtle differences in body size. And so the implication is that, differences in overall size ought to not be inevitably equated with differences in function. In that, if you were to compare the brain of a male who's 6'10" to me, for example, right, who's about a foot shorter, you're likely to see, similar neurological differences, right? Despite the fact that we're both male. And so this group dives into the, relative values of focusing on each of those anatomical assessments, intracranial volume, total brain volume, and so on, gray matter, white matter. And they also dive into another methodological problem that's inherent to these types of techniques, that the techniques that are typically used to assess human brains. And the points they make strike me as being pretty reasonable, right? They highlight that when it comes to, the ways that neuroimaging is conducted with humans, the software used, the algorithms used, and the sort of anatomical baseline used to process the data that they collect, from humans, those methods result in biases. And they ultimately suggest that this results in distortions of how we ultimately measure anatomical structures. Okay, and so, I'm not a cognitive neuroscientist, right? I focused on circuits. And so I don't feel like I can really adequately critique this argument that they're making here. They seem legit, arguments, but someone who's focused on those techniques, specifically may be able to defend them in a way that I can't. Those methods that they're saying result in some biases in terms of how you collect data. That said, I can confidently tell you that at the microscopic level, which is where I lived, there can be issues with how it is that various labs conduct their microscopy, working with microscopes, that can result in differences between, what different labs find. And so, those methodological differences can potentially result in differences in how neuroanatomy is interpreted, right? And so this is only relevant to a tiny, tiny sliver of neuroscience research, just to be clear. But, their critiques are they felt somewhat familiar to my experience at the more microscopic level, at the circuit level. So, I remember chatting with a member of a different lab about how they evaluate expression of viruses after they infuse them, which is what I did to understand how different circuits were organized, how different neurons were communicating with one another to control the activities of neurons, right? So I asked them how they evaluate the expression of the viruses that they used. And it was just totally clear to me that they weren't nearly as scrupulous as we were regarding the effects that I observed after I infused virus, right? I'm not trying to argue that I or that we, our lab group, were or are the authority on virus production and infusion or anything like that. I'm just letting you know that there is some potentially meaningful variability in how science is conducted in different labs, which is why you need so many labs to ask the same question, optimally with similar techniques. But again, the critiques of cognitive neuroscience, assessments, right, that are in today's paper, this paper, Ditch the Dimorphism, they're really not my domain of neuroscience. But it wouldn't surprise me if I would agree with them. So moving on. So the group explores subcortical structures, right? So meaning, parts of the brain that aren't wrinkly. And they found that, while some early and very influential studies did indeed argue that there were meaningful differences in the sizes of structures like the hippocampus and the amygdala, structures you might have heard of, more recent studies have failed to reproduce those findings, or at least, to nearly the same level of confidence as those earlier studies, right? And so this group, explores other structures, other methods to compare neurophysiology, and they arrive at similar conclusions. Differences that have been identified in the past just aren't reliably reproduced and suffer from methodological flaws that, really require any good scientist to reconsider their findings. And so, another thing that this study targets, again, this one, is one of the more long-standing concepts of how the brains of males and females differ. That a male brain is more lateralized, meaning, each hemisphere of the brain operates a little bit more independently of each other, while the brains of females have greater connectivity between the hemispheres. Okay, and so if you've ever heard of any difference between male and female brains, that's almost certainly one that you've encountered. I'm sure it's taught in neuroscience classes. And the group, once again, they found that these differences were rather minuscule. And so why would that matter? Why would the whole lateralization, potential difference in lateralization matter? So, apart from obviously some theoretical differences in function, capabilities and stuff like that, and the patterns of activity that are likely to arise from that difference in architecture, that difference in what is reduced inter-hemispheric connectivity, right? Which is what the concept was for the brains of males, with the hemispheres not being as connected to one another as a female brain would be. That would theoretically put males at a higher risk of compromised capabilities and damage after a traumatic brain injury or a stroke. Just because there's not as much crosstalk between the bilateral structures, the structures in either hemisphere of the brain, as there theoretically would be in females. But yeah, so they found that those differences in hemispheric connectivity just were quite a bit smaller than I think were initially portrayed as being. And so studies in the past have found that there don't appear to be significant differences in the outcomes of strokes. Things like aphasia, the loss of language function. And so they're finding that, between males and females, there haven't been studies that have identified significant differences in how males and females, respond after a stroke, right? And so they're finding that these hemispheric differences weren't quite as significant as we might have thought previously. That would basically corroborate the notion that this may not be as significant of an effect, right, or of a sexual dimorphism as we were sort of initially thought. And so there's a part of this study. So this study has sort of made waves throughout the scientific community And there's a part of this study that doesn't seem to have gotten as much attention as I expect it would have. And so I'm just going to quote it. So a recent comparison of SG, and so pause quote, SG is their combination of like sex and gender identification. So quote, a recent comparison of SG differences in Chinese versus American samples found almost no overlap in brain regions that discriminate males from females based on sulcal depth, sort of valleys of the wrinkles, cortical thickness, and myelin content. In other words, SG discriminatory features are highly population specific, probably reflecting a combination of local genetic and environmental influences, end quote. So fundamentally, the point they're highlighting is that, male and female brains, the differences between them just aren't well replicated among diverse populations, right? Chinese and American in this case. And so in other words, there's no like universal female or universal male brain, particularly across different racial groups. So that's actually a bigger claim than the sole point they're making, that there's no universal female or male brain. But perhaps we can thoroughly interrogate the implications of a claim like that another day. So another part of the study that I'm surprised hasn't irked more people is that, so they argue that, quote, in spite of the quarter century of research in this area, there's no reliable evidence that male and female brains process language differently. And then later, quote, it is safe to conclude that fMRI research has failed to uncover meaningful differences in the circuits of males and females, males and females use to perceive, process, or generate language, end quote. So they argue, they explore this argument that males have like an increased capability with spatial navigation. And perhaps you're sensing a theme here, right? They find that the studies just haven't really identified consistent differences between males and females in that capability. And so they note cognitive neuro, comparisons of in different anatomical structures, like, the hippocampus, the perihippocampus, retrosplenial areas. These are structures that would be involved in that kind of capability, that spatial capability. And so they note that, various comparisons in those structures have failed to indicate measurable differences. And so they note that among trained military pilots, no significant difference in mental rotation or navigational capabilities have been reliably demonstrated, right? So obviously when you're a pilot, that is, I don't know if there's an even a task that's more demanding in spatial navigation than being a pilot, right? Particularly in the military with those super duper fast planes. And so there, no significant differences. And so, ostensibly both male and female pilots would receive the same training to become pilots, have to pass the same classes and so on. And so, if there's no difference identified there, then perhaps there's no significant effect of sex, right? Okay. So, the same theme runs through the rest of their analysis, right? The differences we've all sort of like internalized and just sort of accepted as common wisdom, they don't seem to be as reliable as they might have appeared upon, broader and closer scrutiny, okay? So like any bit of research, as people who are interested in scrutinizing any new scientific findings, we need to consider the limitations of every study, including this one, of course. And so probably the most critical limitation of this study is that it only considers a few methods of characterizing the human brain, MRI, fMRI, right? Techniques that are capable of measuring, the human brain that are used widely throughout the world. And so, measurements of like broad scale, just large neuroanatomy, right? That you can like literally see with your eyes, or not literally, but pretty much. And so they intrinsically acknowledge this limitation, right, in their argument. But of course, it implies that there very well could be a difference between males and females, the brains of males and females, but it's only measurable at levels of biology that are just still too small for the kinds of studies that were included in this meta-analysis to have detected, right? The technology just isn't quite there. And so, there's nothing wrong with using currently available technology as tools to engage this question, right? You got to start somewhere, but it's certainly not the only way to interrogate the brain and consciousness. So it may very well be that there are consequential differences, meaningful differences that would matter to us between male and female brains, but they're just not detectable at the scale at which MRI, for example, which is one of the more widely techniques, where you basically just get pictures of the brain, at the scale at which MRI operates, the large scale, scale anatomy, right? So like differences in circuitry, for example, the kind of things that I study, or in molecular profiles. Oh, geez. Huh, okay. I just saw that the bit rate is awful. Let's see. Hopefully that'll fix it. Sorry, I hope it's not too choppy. But anyway, so you know, right. So you know, it could very well be that, you know, these studies just aren't designed to be capable of detecting where the differences really are. And so as of now, at least according to their scrutiny of the literature, there don't seem to be very meaningful differences, right, that can predictably distinguish, you know, a male brain from a female brain. That said, okay, other papers came out pretty recently that did identify differences between males and females. Okay, so this group, for example, did indeed identify differences between male and female, what are called cortical morphological networks, which is, you know, basically it's arguing that there are meaningful anatomical differences that are consistent among males and females. And so what the reason that this study is worth acknowledging is that this group can basically predict whether someone was male or female based on the neuroimaging data, right, that they collected, okay? And they were using a few of the same things, right, that the main study we're discussing noted, right, you know, ditch the dimorphism study. Cortical volume, cortical thickness, folding, right? They're obviously, they're focused on the cortex, okay? But you know, the cortex is pretty important to the human brain, right? It's unusually large in the human brain relative to other primates. So they're focusing on one part of the brain, but it's a very important part of the brain and a big one. So what they found is that females had higher volume, thickness, and cortical folding in circuits that include the prefrontal and parietal regions, right? And there was a general focus on the frontal and parietal lobes that distinguished males and females, right? So for males, they found a higher volume, thickness, and cortical folding in circuits including the temporal and posterior cortical regions, right? So sort of here and, you know, sort of back here in general. Whereas, you know, for females, it was, you know, frontal and parietal. Okay, so yeah, frontal and sort of parietal, like right here. Okay, so this group right here, they arrived at other findings, but the point is that they were able to discriminate, you know, male and female neuroimaging, right? And you know, importantly, they were focused on cortical regions again, so you know, the outermost regions of the brain, but and they were exclusively using MRI, but they found what they found, right? And it was peer reviewed, and you know, we absolutely ought to consider these results, particularly since, you know, they weren't included in the meta-analysis, this one, that we're primarily discussing today, right? It was not included, it wasn't published yet. And so I also think it's worth acknowledging that Lise Elliott, the lead author on the main study, the ditch the dimorphism study, has been making this argument that the differences between male and female brains are significantly overblown for quite a while, okay? And so she published a book right there in 2010. So, you know, over 10 years ago, called Pink Brain, Blue Brain. And I haven't read this book, but it seems that her argument is that, or the argument in this book, is that it comports, right, with the finding of this meta-analysis, right, that we discussed, the ditch the dimorphism study, that there's no such thing as a categorically male or female brain. And so, you know, so she's been, you know, making this argument now for quite a long time. And so that might strike some folks as being sort of a critical problem, that any scientist would approach a question with like a preconceived notion about the outcomes or a hypothesis. But the reality is, if I were in her shoes, I imagine that my counter-argument, my defense, if I were her, if I were Lise Elliott, would be, I've been working in this field for years and years, and I've consumed the research on this topic for quite a long time, and there's a reason that I've developed the hypothesis that I have, right? So in other words, like, you're right that this is the approach that I took to this question when forming my hypothesis, but it was informed by my years of experience in the field, and I conducted my meta-analysis objectively, right? It's not like I was biased in how I scrutinized the literature, and it just so happened to justify my hypothesis, right? I happened to reject my null hypothesis. That's the technical term for that. And so to me, you know, I think that's a reasonable defense. You know, again, I'm like speaking for her, right? But and, you know, I haven't seen her encounter this question, but you know, to me, that would be a reasonable explanation. So like if I were to join a lab, let's say next week, that's exploring the medial lobenula interpeduncular nucleus circuit, right? That's what I studied for my PhD. And we were going to evaluate whether it might regulate anxiety or depression, right? Which is essentially what I did. I'd absolutely be predisposed to hypothesis walking in the door of that lab, right? And into those experiments. But as a good scientist, of course, I would conduct and design my experiments such that my own bias, right, would be mitigated. right, would be like, removed from the results as much as possible, right? Otherwise, I'd be compromising my future career as a scientist, right? I would publish nonsense. And you can't have a career in science if you're publishing nonsense, right? So here's what we do, okay? We ingest the results of this meta-analysis, the ditch the dimorphism meta-analysis. And we consider all of these factors, understanding that every scientist is a human, right? And we assume that each peer-reviewed publication is from a group of scientists who did their best to minimize their biases, scrutinizing whether they did or didn't. We can scrutinize that by looking at their methods section in their papers, right? So that's what we do with this study right now, right, as consumers of this science. But so where does this leave us? So honestly, and I know this is like not particularly satisfying, pretty much where we were. It's not 100% convincingly clear if there are meaningful functional differences between the brains of males and females. We can be fairly confident about the general, differences in brain sizes. But when it comes to the question of whether there's, any actually like interesting differences between males and females that are truly consistent, it seems unlikely, right? Given this large meta-analysis, but at least still somewhat inconclusive. And I'm coming to you as someone who spent his years focused on the networks of specific neurons within specific brain regions. I may just be being like obnoxious because I focused on the activity of circuits, but, and these data focus on, assessments of human neurobiology that don't really reach down to that more microscopic level of biology, right? Which is where what I cared about. And to be clear, like they're not making any claims at those levels of biology. They're not like making any claims about the distinctions in circuitry. But obviously, I tend to think that the most consequential level of activity in the brain is at a level that's smaller than what was included in this study or in this meta-analysis, in the studies that were included in this meta-analysis. At a level that's indetectable, right, by the methods that were included in the studies that were that were included in this meta-analysis. So for me, it fundamentally comes down to the fact that like we don't really have technology that can interrogate the human brain at the levels that may or may not detect meaningful neurophysiological differences between males and females. Okay, we're just not quite there yet. But this study did certainly help to conduct a more scrupulous, to scrutinize this a little bit more scrupulously, okay, the body of research, right, that we've all been using to determine whether there are meaningful differences between males and females. And ultimately their finding is we really ought to reconsider whether there are meaningful neuroanatomical differences, right, that actually warrant our concern or that are actually meaningful, that we would actually care about. And so, given the ambiguity in the existence of these differences, right, we need to like really consider that the differences may be trivial enough that environmental factors really dominate how a person develops. And, until we're able to interrogate, human neurophysiology at potentially more relevant, meaning microscopic, levels of biology, we might as well avoid making any assumptions based on, assumed differences between males and females, or at least the brains of males and females based in biology, okay? And so that's where I landed at the end of this study. It's definitely a controversial study. Plenty of debate going on among scientists right now. And if there's one thing about which we can be entirely confident, there will be subsequent studies on this topic. And honestly, this is totally where I expected to land, right, when I saw this study come out, right? Like, I definitely didn't expect to be, like, all right, got it, question answered. Next question, right? What's the meaning of life, right? I didn't expect this question to be just, like, conclusively answered. And so by the way, I did link all of the main studies that I referenced in the description below, along with two others that I didn't end up referencing, but were quite interesting. So one of them is this one. So this one explores that more microscopic level at which males and females may vary more consistently. But until we can, explore a larger collection of studies like this one, I think we just have to keep waiting, right, until more science is done. So by the way, when it comes to this study, check out how many authors are on this paper. It's crazy, totally crazy. And the institutions that are represented in this study, again, which you should check out: Massachusetts General, Harvard, MIT, Denmark, Yale, Colorado State University, University of Aberdeen, Queensland, UNC Chapel Hill, Virginia Commonwealth University, Karolinska, Helsinki, Hong Kong, Johns Hopkins, University of Chicago, Mount Sinai, Munich, University College London, King's College London, University of Southern California, SUNY, Singapore, Oslo, UCLA, Malaga, or Malaga, Frankfurt, and on and on and on. It's like an insane collaboration. It's so big. And so, maybe we'll take a deeper dive into the genetics that this group did and what they discovered, which, it does identify consistent differences in how the brain develops, in the immune system, and in the vascular systems between males and females among, specific groups of humans. But anyways, here, I'll take this off. It's crazy. Until then, thank you for joining me. And if you stuck with me until this point, maybe you'll consider subscribing and giving me some feedback on topics that you'd like to explore, right? The science underlying certain topics that you'd like to explore, or ways that I can improve what I'm doing. I'm very receptive to any advice you might have. Otherwise, stay safe, wear your masks, and I will see you next weekend. All right, yeah, so thanks everybody for joining, and I guess I'm just going to close it there. It's kind of sort of surreal to close it this early without having a Periscope live chat, but maybe at some point again in the future. Oh, I'm also on a live streaming platform called HAPS, HAPPS.tv. That's a new live streaming platform. It's still, kind of small, but it's growing, and it has great tools, and it's a great community, and great philosophy among the sort of management team and the founders. They have backgrounds in like journalism rather than in sort of Silicon Valley or startups or venture capital, these types of things. And so I hope you'll check it out, haps.tv. I'll put a link to my profile there in the description below. But otherwise, I will see you next weekend. See you, everybody.